Beautifully done, Acacia, and more to come tomorrow morning. With the birth of Esau and Jacob, the twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah that we read about at the very beginning of our weekly portion tomorrow, trouble and strife are unleashed into the world. Rebekah's pain during her pregnancy, the children pressing against each other inside her, God's prediction to her that 2 peoples are in your belly, 2 nations shall branch off from each other. 1 people shall prevail over the other. The elder shall serve the younger. The contrast between these 2 brothers, twins, could not be greater. One covered with a hairy mantle, a skillful hunter, a man of the outdoors. The other a homespun man, keeping to the tents. One who spurns his birthright, famished from a day of outdoor hunting in the field, rashly exchanging his birthright for a bowl of red stew, in the first of many deceptions practiced by the younger brother Jacob. And Jacob, in an act of guile, masterminded by his mother, disguising himself as his older brother in order to steal the blessing reserved for Esau, an act that drives him away from his family to the home of his maternal uncle in Haran for 20 years. And we'll hear some of that story of the deception tomorrow. More tribulation is to come for Jacob, a deception practiced by his uncle Laban, who refuses to allow him to marry his younger daughter Rachel until he has first married the elder, Leah. Jealousy among Jacob's sons that results in the tragic loss of his favorite son Joseph for 17 years. The violation of his only daughter Dinah, famine in the land of Israel, and as an old man, Jacob's removal to Egypt, where he tells Pharaoh, "Few and evil have been the days of my life." Of course, this is not the first time in the Torah that disorder and anguish enter the world. The rabbis of Midrashic literature, in a somewhat misogynistic way, fastened on the story of the creation of Eve, the first woman, as the source of humanity's troubles. Had she not been enticed by the serpent to eat of the fruit of the tree and to give it to her man who was with her, those who criticize the woman for her disobedience argue that the wish to be like God, the usurpation of divine power, prompts her to transgress the divine command not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Once the woman and the man have eaten of the tree, they realize that they're naked and hide themselves. Discovered by God, they are thrust out of the Garden of Eden. The serpent to crawl on its belly and eat dust, the woman to bear children with anguish, and the man to till the soil by the sweat of his brow. And so even here, discord and turmoil enter the world. The rabbis relate this parable to the story of Adam and Eve. This comes a lot later in our Jewish literature, after the biblical story. They tell this story. Once upon a time, there was a king who had a faithful servant. He wanted to find a wife for his servant, and eventually he found a woman, beautiful in form and face, and he arranged for the woman to be married to his servant. The king said to her, "Look, I'm putting you in charge of the silver, the gold, precious stones, and all the pearls that are in my treasury. I give everything over to you to take care of, except for this one jar which is filled with scorpions." One day, as the woman was at home by herself, an old woman came and knocked at the door of her house. She opened the door. "How can I help you?" she asked. The old woman wanted to borrow some vinegar. "Come in," said the younger woman. "Sit down. Have something to drink." So the old woman sat down at the table and asked the young bride, "How is the king, the master, teaching you?" "In a fine manner," she said. "But there's just one thing that's disturbing me, and that is this one jar that is filled with scorpions." "Ah," said the old woman, "take no notice of that. All of your husband's jewelry is in that jar, and he wants to marry another woman and give it to her." Immediately, the younger woman put her hand into the jar, and scorpions bit her. And the rabbis explain the parable in this way. The king is God, the Holy One. His servant and his wife are Adam and Eve. And the old woman who wants to borrow some vinegar is the serpent who tempts the woman to eat the fruit. Now, Acacia, I wonder if this story of the jar with the scorpions reminds you of another story, another myth, not Jewish, that might have been familiar to the rabbis and who perhaps adapted it to fit their own ends. You'll see what I mean in a minute. In Greek mythology, the woman who puts her hand into a jar is Pandora. It's a jar, not a box in the Greek. And in Hesiod's version of the myth, releases from the box mischief and sorrow, plague and diseases, shutting the lid too late to prevent all these evils from entering the world. Like Eve, Pandora is the first woman in the world, fashioned not from the rib of her man, but from clay. Like many of the midrashim created by the rabbinic imagination, the first woman is beautiful and gifted, but also mischievous and deceitful. In the Torah, God warns Adam not to eat of the fruit of the tree. In the Pandora myth, it's Prometheus who warns his brother Epimetheus not to accept any gifts from Zeus. Eve, tempted by the serpent, causes her own and her husband's banishment from the Garden of Eden, while Pandora, prompted by curiosity, brings misfortunes upon herself, her husband, and all mortal beings. And on the left is a picture of Pandora with her jar, and on the right is Eve being tempted by the serpent. And so even artistically, there's a sort of similarity you can see between the two stories, Eve offering the fruit to her husband and Pandora with her jar and her husband. Now, I imagine these attitudes to women have a great deal to answer from in these ancient stories about women. And if we had more time, we might reinterpret them for our own era. But I mention these stories this evening because you, Acacia, have a leading role in the London Youth Opera's production of a new opera called Pandora's Box. And in telling me the version of the story as told in the opera, when we met yesterday, I was encouraged by your teacher, Susanna, because we had a little chat about it afterwards, to see whether Jewish literature knew of this ancient Greek myth and if they did, what they made of it. Well, we've seen that the rabbis of old probably were familiar with the story of Pandora's box, and they adapted that myth to fit their own parable based on the story of Adam and Eve and the banishment from the Garden of Eden. But there is one very important part of the Greek myth which I haven't mentioned. As Pandora slams the lid back onto the jar, or her box, one thing fails to escape. Do you know what it is? That is hope. Hope becomes trapped in the rim of the jar. So the very object that contains all the suffering and anguish in the world also contains something promising and redemptive. And just as Pandora's jar holds the possibility of deliverance and liberation, so too in the Torah's creation story, it is the woman whose intelligence and curiosity sees in the fruit a source of knowledge, wisdom, and insight. And these, as she says in Genesis, these become the very attributes that God requires us to attain for ourselves. As it's written in the book of Proverbs, may we learn wisdom and discipline. May we increase our understanding to speak words of discernment. May we go out into the world to do righteous deeds, to lessen suffering and trouble, and to pursue justice and equity, and so bring hope and peace into the world. Amen.